Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to answer the question, what in the world is a controller? Let's dive right into the action. So remember in our previous lesson, we created a few routes or URL patterns to watch for. So in our main app project folder, in the routes folder, if you go into web.php, remember we have our homepage route and our about page route. But remember, in the real world, for example, our homepage, it's not going to be just one line of code where you return a string of text. Instead, you might need to fetch data from a database or some sort of third-party API, or make some sort of decision based on the current user that's visiting the homepage, so on and so forth. Right? You're going to need to do a lot of different things, and the idea is that this function might be 30 or 40 lines of code. So we don't want our overall routes file to get messy. So for the sake of staying organized and keeping this file clean, we would want to move these functions to live in a totally separate file. And that's exactly where a controller comes into play. So right now, let's create our first controller. We actually do this through the command line. So go ahead and open up your command line. If your Laravel server was up and running, remember you can just press Control-C to stop it. Right? And then you'll be free to run a command with me. So in our Laravel project directory, run this with me. Say php artisan make and then colon. So it's still no space, not a new word, just make colon controller. Space, and then we get to make up a name for our controller. There's nothing special about this name. I'm just making it up, but why don't we call it example controller? So go ahead and press enter. Okay, and now if you look inside the app folder, and then look inside the HTTP folder, look inside the controllers folder, you'll see this brand new file named example controller. So you can go ahead and double click on it to open it up. Now really quick, before we actually start working on this controller file, I want to show you how to create another controller. So you could just push the up arrow down in the command line to run the same command again. And then for that final argument, right, so it's php artisan make colon controller, and then you can name it. So the idea is that you can have as many controllers as you want. So I run that again with the name of pizza. I run it again with the name of unicorn. All that's going to do is create these different files for us in the controllers folder. Not only will Laravel create a new file, but it will also, if you jump into the file, write a little bit of boilerplate for us. Now, we don't actually need controllers named pizza and unicorn, so I'm actually going to go ahead and delete the pizza.php. And I'm also going to delete unicorn.php, right? But let's go ahead and actually work on this file named examplecontroller.php, right? The first controller that we just created. So down here in this area where it says class and whatever name you chose extends controller, and then in these curly brackets, inside the curly brackets, you can get rid of the / for the comma, and let's create our first method or function in this controller. So let's say public function, and now we can make up any name we want. But why don't we go ahead and call it homepage, parentheses, curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets, you can drop down, and now this is where we would just do whatever we were doing in the routes file. So for example, you could literally just copy this line into your clipboard, right? The line where we return a string of text. So I would just select that entire line, copy it into your clipboard, and then on this line, inside our public function named homepage, just paste it in. Cool. Let's also go ahead and do the same thing for the About Us page. So below this function, but still in the class curly brackets, so right about here, I would just say public function. And now there's nothing special about these names of homepage or, about page, but just so you and I are on the same page, if you want to use the same names as me, that's okay. But parentheses, curly brackets, inside the curly brackets, let's just copy over this line, right? The About Us page, a little bit of string that we are returning. So I'd copy that and then just paste it right here. Cool. Let's go ahead and save this file. And now back in our routes file, instead of just having these anonymous spelled out functions here, let's point towards our controller's methods. So first of all, up at the very top of this web.php file, we would want to import or begin using our new controller. So do this with me. Up around line number 3, maybe right below this line that already exists, let's add a brand new line and say use, and then it's uppercase app backslash, not forward slash, but a backslash, http backslash controllers backslash example controller, and be sure to end it with a semicolon. So essentially, we're importing or using our new controller from within this routes file. So now that we've imported example controller, let's actually use it down here. So for example, let's start with our homepage route. You would delete from the word function until the closing curly bracket, right? So it's just, we're calling this get method. This is the first argument, comma. And then for the second argument, we would want to point towards this homepage method that belongs to our example controller. Now, it's important to point out that we don't want to immediately call or execute that function. We just want to point towards it, right? We're just telling Laravel, hey, this is where the function lives, and it will be up to Laravel to actually call or execute it at the right moment. Now, in PHP, in order to provide a callable reference to a function like that, the syntax does feel a little bit weird to me compared to a language like JavaScript, for example. But here's how you would do that in PHP. We actually provide an array, so square brackets. In the array, we're going to give it 2 items, so a comma b as placeholders. The first thing we give it is the name of our controller, so that's just example controller, and then colon, and then lowercase, just the word class. This just makes sure that it will point towards the full namespace of our controller. And then instead of B, this is the actual name of the specific method. So that would be quotes, and then we named it homepage. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for our about route. So I would delete from the beginning of the word function to this closing curly bracket. Instead, I would give it square brackets for an array, say example controller, colon, class, comma, the name of this specific method. We named it about, and then I named it uppercase page, right? About page. If you go back into your controller, you would just need this name to match. So about uppercase page, cool. Let's go ahead and save this, and then let's spin up our dev server to test it out. So in the command line, you would just run php artisan serve. Now, in your web browser, you can go ahead and visit 127.0.0.1:8000, or you could visit localhost:8000. But as soon as you visit it, cool, so our pages work. Let's go make a tiny adjustment just to prove that it's using our controller. So for example, let's add a few exclamations after this headline. So you would go into your controller. Here it says homepage in the heading level 1. I would just add a few exclamations here. Do the same thing for the about page just to prove that this code is being used instead of the old functions in the web file. So let's save that change. If you refresh, perfect. This may not seem very impressive because we're still just returning a single string of text, right? We're not doing anything complex. But the idea now is that a controller file can help us stay super organized, right? We don't mind if this function needs to do all sorts of complex things and it's 30 lines of code, right? That's okay because this has its own separate file to keep us organized. Whereas our routes file, right, our web.php file, it can be very minimal, right? It's just spelling out the URL pattern and then it's delegating the task, right? It's calling a function from a totally separate file. This way, even at the end of our application, when we've set up all the different routes, this file will be very clean, almost sort of like a table of contents for our entire application. So where do we go from here? Well, if we jump back into our controller, remember I said that in the real world, for example, this function might be 30 lines of code, and we might be loading data from a database and making all sorts of important decisions, and then sending back a dynamic bit of HTML. Well, don't worry, throughout the course, we're going to learn how to do all sorts of interesting things inside a controller method like that. But in terms of what we're going to do in our very next lesson, we're going to learn about the view engine of Laravel. Because in the real world, we wouldn't want to have to build complex HTML templates just in a simple string like this. You would never ever do this. This was just for a quick example. In the real world, you would use the Blade template engine that Laravel ships with. I am a huge fan of Blade. It lets us create HTML in a super clean and organized way. And in our very next lesson, we're going to learn how to create an entirely separate view or template file to output HTML in an organized fashion. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson.